On this episode of Doing the Most, we're going to talk about the top 5 reasons some people think they just can't homebrew.
Homemade brews and various how-tos, everything from mead to roast, bake creation, fermentation, inebriation, doing the most.
A while back on our YouTube community page, I asked you, what are some reasons that you had that were kind of barriers to entry for you getting into the homebrewing hobby? I wanted to hear everything you had to say, all those little reasons why you thought maybe this just isn't the hobby for me. And when I went back and took a look at the information, the data was kind of clear that there were 5 main categories of things that just really led people to believe that maybe they just couldn't homebrew. So in this video, we're going to talk about those 5 things and why you should put them out of mind, because homebrewing is for you. And if you're already a homebrewer, obviously I want you to watch this video, but maybe share this with a friend who you've been trying to get to be your brew buddy and you just haven't been able to convince them yet. So let's dive in. Number 1, it's too expensive. You know, any hobby can become too expensive. Look at collecting and painting minifigs or collecting baseball or Pokemon cards. You can get really into the high expenses in some of these hobbies, and homebrewing is no exception. Especially if you're making something like beer. Beer brewing can get really expensive depending on the level and type of equipment that you want to brew with and how big of batches you think you want to brew. I would argue that making beer has the highest potential for being an expensive homebrewing venture. And, you know, again, it's because of the gear and equipment that is sometimes required. You can do a stovetop batch, no problem, but if you're looking to make 5 or 10 or 15 gallons of beer, the scale of equipment required to get there can set you back a pretty penny. And I would say that secondarily, mead is probably the highest potential for being an expensive introduction to homebrewing, and that's simply because honey is the most expensive fermentable sugar you can get. But small-scale mead brewing can still be inexpensive, and making country fruit wines or grape juice wines or ciders can be really inexpensive entries to the hobby. Apple juice and grape juice from the grocery store, even that like cran apple juice, are real low barrier to entry, real inexpensive, and typically are pretty good, reliable fermenters. And really, I caution anybody who's getting into any hobby not to just dive into the deep end from the start, because that's definitely a way to get swamped in expenses. Start out small and figure out if you like the hobby before you buy an all-in-one electric brewing system and build your own keezer, because maybe you'll find that you don't have anything to brew or put in those because you've spent all of your brewing budget. Get a few brews under your belt and make a list of what you liked and didn't like about the process, and then maybe your expenses for the next month go toward the things that would improve your product or your process as you've noticed it while doing your previous batches. And never buy a piece of gear that doesn't have a purpose in your homebrewing arsenal. If you can make a really great cider with apple juice and a glass jug and an airlock and some yeast, then keep doing that as long as it makes you happy. There's no reason to buy an apple crusher and a fruit press and a conical fermenter and all that stuff unless you feel like you need it in order to advance up in the hobby. Number 2, it's too time consuming. Making beer can be time consuming. A typical brew day for me is about 4 to 4.5 hours, depending on how long my boil is, and that can consume basically my whole Saturday or Sunday morning. That's time consuming. But on the other end of it, you kind of set it and forget it. Once it's in the fermenter, other than bottling, a lot of your time is just spent waiting. And if you make cider or wine or mead, mixing it up, you had 30-minute or maybe an hour at tops process to mix up a wine or mead is really, other than bottling, all the time that's required to get those brews from yeast pitch into your mouth. Some things in homebrewing do take time, like cleaning and sanitizing and regular checks of your gravity or staggered nutrient additions where you're adding a little bit of nutrient every few days. Those things can suck up some time, and of course bottling can suck up some time. But the time output versus the reward of getting to drink something that you made yourself, I would argue, is absolutely worth it. And especially if you're doing 1 or 2 batches at a time, not, 15 or 20 like I typically am, it's not that big of a time commitment. You can spare the time. I believe in you. Number 3, it's dangerous. Now, there are 2 main reasons why homebrewing might be dangerous: mold infections and bottle bombs. And mold can really be relatively easily avoided. Getting a mold infection in your homebrew is actually not super common. And as long as you're sanitizing your gear and equipment, you're pitching a fast-acting yeast that's really going to get in there and go to town and create alcohol and carbon dioxide. And as long as you're checking fruit for mold before you brew with it and punching the fruit cap if you're brewing with fruit to make sure it stays wet and there's carbon dioxide on top of it so that mold can't even get hold, you're probably pretty unlikely to see a mold infection. And if you do, being wise enough to go ahead and dump that batch out, you're going to avoid any health problems of mold in homebrewing. Now, to avoid bottle bombs, you really want to use a hydrometer. You want to make sure that your brews are done before they go in a bottle. And using a hydrometer to measure your fermentation progress is the best way of doing that on a home scale. And if you do have any residual sugar in your brews and you're concerned before bottling that might lead to bottle bombs, that those sugars might begin to re-ferment in the bottle, stabilizing or pasteurizing is a good way of putting those concerns to rest. And if you're bottle conditioning, say, so you can have a carbonated beer or cider or mead in the bottle, you should use a priming sugar calculator and double check your math 2 or 3 times to make sure you have the right amount of sugar added to your batch. Also, either rack onto those priming sugars or just stir really well so you can make sure that the sugars are mixed throughout the batch so you don't have higher concentrations of priming sugar in one part, lower in another part, which would lead to inconsistently primed bottles, meaning some might be flat and others might explode. Bottle conditioning is actually relatively simple and danger-free, provided that you are doing multiple checks to make sure you've done everything right. Other than these 2 things, mold and bottle bombs, there aren't many dangers in homebrewing. You're not going to go blind. You're very unlikely to encounter botulism. And, at worst, you're probably likeliest going to get a hangover from enjoying the fruits of your labor a little bit too much. Number 4, it's overwhelmingly complex. It's too complicated. It's over my head. It's not for me. This is just not true. You can make a really great product with some very simple gear and practices, just like I mentioned earlier about expense. Homebrewing can be as complex or as simple as you want it to be. Again, with a jug and an airlock and some grape juice and a little bit of rudimentary balancing work, you can make something really nice, really drinkable out of grocery store grape juice. A really nice little table wine for yourself. And on the beer side, with a stock pot and some ice, you can make yourself a pretty darn good beer on your stovetop. Or you can go all the way down the rabbit hole with an all-in-one electric system and fermentation control units and a keezer with 8 different taps of all of your homebrew. But you don't have to. Like most hobbies, homebrewing can become more and more complex the further into it you get. But it doesn't have to if you don't want it to. It can be as simple as making some wine or cider in your kitchen. And finally, number 5, it's just hard to make something that tastes good. This, again, couldn't be further from the truth. It's fairly easy to make something that tastes good. As you may have seen on the channel, we have a Merlot Piment that is a mead made with grape juice, and it is about as simple as it can get. And that mead recently won a blue ribbon. So it can be done, and it can be done simply. But there is a little bit of objective truth to that too. Just because this is a really good mead doesn't mean it's the greatest mead that I've ever made. It means that it's drinkable and enjoyable. And there's kind of a blurry line between drinkable and phenomenal, right? And I think that this Merlot falls into the high end of that blurry line. But sometimes drinkable is all you want. Sometimes all you want is a delicious sparkling cider you can have a couple of in the backyard after you've mowed your lawn. And that is perfectly okay. Really, really excellent stuff does take practice, takes attention to detail, and it takes some palate work to learn how balancing works. We've got a recent video on that. And that takes time. And for me, learning how to make really great stuff has taken over a decade of homebrewing. I've been at this a while. And so it's not a thing that happens overnight, and that's not an expectation you should set for yourself as you start getting into this hobby. But just like it can be a little difficult to make something truly great, and not so difficult to make something good, it actually can be kind of difficult to make something that's truly awful. And again, learning how to balance can help prevent that, but also just using some very common, very simple best practices can help you avoid truly terrible homebrew. And I'll put in a little plug for our card deck end game, Sip and Savor. It's full of 150 vocabulary terms to help you refine your palate in homebrewing, and I find that they're really helpful in learning how to describe what it is you're tasting, smelling, sensing in your homebrew in order to make notes about what you might change next time, or when you're sharing it with friends so that you can all kind of have the same vocabulary words when you're describing what it is you're sensing. Just a quick plug, just a quick one. So I hope I have put off all of your concerns. If you have just started homebrewing or you're thinking about it, please share this video across the social medias, hit that like button down there and subscribe to our channel, because we have all kinds of homebrewing content like this that kind of spans the realm of beginner to advanced. So you might find yourself here next week finding another video that you love. And of course, we have a Discord community with like over 1,000 folks, many of whom are homebrewing wizards and standing by to answer your questions, help you out, get that first brew going. And we're on Instagram and post pretty pictures there sometimes, so check us out there. Until next time, stay safe, keep an eye on your pocketbook, make those processes as simple or as complex as you want, and enjoy your homebrew. Enjoy it. You made it. You deserve to take pleasure in it.